What is going on, everybody? Covering the Alekhine Gambit. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, Scotch, e takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight f6, the Schmidt Variation. The push of the e-pawn to e5 makes the Alekhine Gambit. There are two main moves, one being knight captures e5 if you want to accept the gambit, and if you want to decline the gambit, queen to e7, pinning the pawn to the king, is the proper response. I have seen a couple games where the knight will either come to e4 or d5. More or less, if it comes to e4, the knights want to be traded off on c6, and if they capture with the b pawn, this is kind of like a Mises variation where the knight jumps to e4, which that line will be covered. It's actually a crazy one, mark my words, where it's a draw between the queen bobbing back and forth between g3 and h3, and the king goes between g1 and h1. Mark my words, this is how much, like, everything's all mushed together. It's actually much better for black in this situation to capture the knight with the d-pawn and exchange out queens. What you want to do if this does happen is move your bishop to c4, hitting the weak f7 pawn. That's all I'm going to go down this line. And the queens are gone. It's open. It's a pretty standard game. The only thing I will mention, if they blunder and put the bishop to c5, doubling up on f2, push f3, and now the knight has nowhere to go because the dark square bishop took the only square that the knight had to escape to. I guess if they tried coming in for a check, just move over your king and wait for something to happen. If the bishop moves, then take the knight, and if the knight moves, take the bishop. Backing out. Any knight move from this position is dubious. Last one I'll cover real quick is if the knight jumps to d5. My opinion on how to respond is bringing your knight to b5 to open up an attack on the knight with your queen. And we're pretty far out on the fringes of what is considered to be reasonable to expect. So I'm going to show you the lines because I'm not going to cover them all. If you want to, you can pause the video and read the lines on the bottom and go through them by yourself. Black only has two good replies to knight b5. They don't have any pieces they can bring in to defend the knight on d5 other than moving the other knight. And why a move like knight e7 doesn't work is because you have very hard to see moves like queen d6. It is not as menacing as it might appear to be. They can always just play a6, and then you can jump in your knight, forking the king and rook. They are able to recapture with the queen, even though there's nothing backing it up, because if you recapture, the knight jump to d5 does trap in your queen. And if for some reason you do go down this line, queen d6 is your best move. They will recapture with the bishop, you recapture with the pawn, and everybody has a merry old good time. The reason why they can't capture with the pawn off the bat is because the recapture would be checkmate. So their two best moves are knight to b6, and in that case, you just want to develop your other knight to b3. They're going to try to kick your knight out, and that's when you can bring your knight to d6 with check. On the recapture, you will recapture with the pawn, and now you're threatening to check with the queen, and anything they block will be gobbled up by the pawn on d6. Their only move that scores good is bringing the queen to f6, and then you can bring your bishop to e3, threatening to take the unprotected knight on b6. If they take your pawn, just go ahead and take the knight, and if they try bringing the queen pinning that bishop, you can just bring out the other bishop unpinning it. And there's no good move that they have, so after they take the pawn, you're good to take the knight anyways. And backing up, the other good move that they have is not moving the knight, but just trying to kick out your knight. And in that case, you can take the knight, they'll take your knight, and you will recapture the pawn with your bishop. So we're going to go ahead and return to the sensible moves. And I will mention that from this position, no titled players, according to FIDE, have played e5, the Alekhine Gambit. Not a single one. With that being said, There's two main options as we spoke about, and we're going to cover queen to e7 first. Your only reply to that is pushing the f-pawn to f4, and black's main reply is pushing d6. But I would feel guilty if I didn't cover the equally good move according to the analysis, knight to e4. I'm going to say bishop to d3 is the best reply, and black has four possibilities to kind of respond to that move with. If they capture your knight on d4, then take their knight on d5. And their best move is pushing d5. Go ahead and capture d4, and when they capture e5, don't hesitate, take e5 as well. And you have to worry about the black queen checking your white king on two different squares. If they do it on h4, go ahead and push g3. And if they do it on b4, go ahead and exchange queens. They'll recapture with the bishop, and you want to block that check with your bishop on d2. If they retreat the bishop, develop your knight to c3, and if they exchange off, you want to recapture with the knight. Black's second option is if they push d5 straight away. If they do that, I would recommend go ahead and capture the knight on e4. If they captured the bishop, take their knight on c6. If they take your knight, go ahead and capture the pawn on d5. They'll bring the queen to c5, bring your bishop to e4, and they'll bring their bishop to f5. Go ahead and capture their bishop, and they'll recapture with the knight. Their third option of four moves is bringing the knight to c5 right away. If that happens, bring your bishop to e3, backing up the knight, since the queen doesn't have access currently. If they capture your knight first, recapture with the bishop. If they take your other bishop after, recapture with the queen. If they take your bishop first, recapture with the queen. And if they take your knight after, recapture with the bishop, not the queen. And I will remind you that during any of this, they can throw in a check. If they do, just block it with your g-pawn. And remind you, they don't have to move their queen right away. They can throw in an intermezzo move, capturing your bishop on d3. If that happens, recapture with your queen, and they'll back out their queen right after. And the last of four moves, being the best, in my opinion, is bringing their queen right to h4 with a check right away. If that happens, push your g-pawn, same thing. And this time, since their knight's on e4, they'll capture that pawn. You cannot recapture with your pawn on the h-file because your rook will fall. So what you have to do is bring your knight to f3, attacking the queen. The only move for the queen which prevents you from capturing the knight safely and doesn't totally ruin their chances of winning is bringing the queen to h3. Bring your rook over to g1. They'll back out with their knight to f5 and go ahead and capture it with your bishop. And after they recapture with their queen, develop your knight to c3. And if you let the computer analysis run long enough, I think I did it to like 36 or 37, and it was zeroed out. It's the only sideline or response to their initial move, knight e4, that was not in their favor. So now that we're discussing all the absolute craziness, let's return to reality. d6 is the only sensible move, and you want to reply with bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king. And their only move is unpinning it with their bishop on d7. You want to capture the knight right away because that'll force black to double their pawns on the c-file. It doesn't matter if they recapture with the pawn and double them right away, or recapture with the bishop. You recapture with the knight, then they double them. That's what you want, because if you were to try something like castle, this is exactly why you don't. It allows black this set of exchanges. D takes e, bishop take knight, bishop take bishop, knight take bishop, and then they have this awesome move, queen c5 check, not only forcing your king to the corner, but being able to recapture with their queen, thus avoiding doubling the pawns on the c-file. So that's why you do want to take out the knight on c6 as soon as possible. The reason why they want to capture with the pawn, not the bishop, is because if they recapture with the bishop, it allows you to recapture, and now, after you castle, their best move is clearing the d-file by capturing the e-pawn, and now the queen will prevent them from castling queenside. We're going to go ahead and finish up the continuations of this position, and then we'll go back and finish up the continuations in the positions that arise from when the pawn captures immediately, and there's not that extra exchanges of bishops on c6. And then that'll wrap up the positions of the gambit declined, and then we'll go over the gambit accepted when the knight on c6 captures the e5 pawn. First, you do want to capture the e pawn with your f pawn, and this is where they have options. The simplest of them is just moving the knight to d7, and if that's the case, we're not going to go any farther other than telling you that you can bring your bishop to f4, you can bring your knight to c3, you can get your king off the diagonal exposed because black has a dark squared bishop and a queen that's on the dark squares. Those are some safe moves. Black also has the option to capture the pawn. Looks crazy, right? Even if the rook comes over, attacking the queen, which is currently pinned, the knight can just jump right in between. And your best option is to bring the knight to c3, doubling up the attack on the knight. And then black can push f5. That's when you can bring your queen to h5 with check. And they can block it with g6. And this is where it gets real crazy. You can capture the knight, and they'll capture your queen. And you can jump to f6 with your knight with check. They can't capture the knight with the queen because it's currently pinned. It doesn't matter if the king goes to f7 or e7. After you capture the queen with your rook, they will capture your knight with their king. And you can bring your bishop to f4, protecting your rook. Black has a couple good tries. First being bishop to b4. You can push a3, and if the bishop comes to d2 attacking your bishop, you can just capture it, leaving your rook unattended. And after the king captures, you can put your bishop on c3, skewering, so once the king moves out the way, you can get the rook in the corner, and when they recapture, material is even. You're down a pawn, but they have 4 different isolated pawn islands. Another attempt that they may try is bringing the bishop right to d6. If that's the case, bring your rook to e1 and allow them to capture the rook, because after they do, you can recapture the bishop with check. When they move out of the way, yet again, you get the rook in the corner, and after they recapture, same deal. And last but not least, they have the attempt of bringing the bishop right to h6. If that's the case, capture the bishop, leave your rook unattended, because after they capture, you have bishop g7, forking the two. And if the king goes to something like f4, you don't want to capture the rook in the corner quite yet. You got something better. You can bring the rook to e1, and if they make the mistake of trying to get out of losing the rook, it's horrible for them, because now you bring your bishop to h6, and they only have 1 square. I'll leave the 2 options in the analysis below so you can go through them just to save some time. They can either give up the rook by putting it on g5 or move the king to g4. Both don't end well. Rewinding back, bada bing, bada boom. We have our last one we're going to cover for now is bringing the rook to d8, attacking your queen. It is best to block with your knight on d2, but it is also possible to bring your queen to either e2 or e1 and not slip in the negatives on the analysis. After your knight comes to d2, they have several moves. They can bring their knight to d7, d5, or e4. The only move I want to mention is if the knight comes to e4, you want to put your queen on e1. And if they trade, recapture with your bishop. And if they come in with the queen for a check, just move over your king and expect to lose the c2 pawn. But if they do, just remain calm and bring your bishop to g5, attacking the rook. The rook will come down to d5, and that's when you just want to back your bishop away and connect it with your queen. You'll be all right. The rest is history. Backing up, now we have to go through the continuations when the pawn recaptures instead of the bishop. From here, you're going to want a castle right away. Black's d-pawn will capture your e-pawn. Your f-pawn will capture the e-pawn. Black's best move is no longer capturing the pawn with the queen, but bringing the knight to g4. You can either bring your knight that's out on d4 to b3. You can bring your knight on b1 to a3 or c3. No matter what, they're going to castle long after. You can also try pushing h3, and they'll take the pawn on e5. And after that, no matter what move you make, they're going to castle long. Remind you, they don't have to move the knight to g4. They can do what they did with the extra exchange on c6 and capture the e5 pawn with the queen. Same thing, you bring out the rook, they will block with the knight. You can develop your knight to c3, they'll push f5, you bring out the queen to h5 check, they'll push the pawn to g6 blocking, you capture the knight, and here they have three different options. One of them being what they did the previous run, capture the queen, you jump the knight to f6 checking, the king coming up, you capturing the queen, them grabbing the knight, and instead of guarding the rook with the bishop, you now bring the knight to f3 guarding the rook. Black can always castle. If they do, you want to bring your queen back to e2, and they're going to capture your knight that's on d4 with the queen. If that's the case, bring your bishop to e3, kicking the queen. The queen's only got 2 squares that it can go to, otherwise it's checkmate. If it backed up like this, you have queen a6 check, forcing the king to b8, queen a7 check, forcing the king to c8, and then queen a8 would be checkmate. So the only 2 squares that the queen has to go to is b4 or a4. You don't have to worry about taking your b2 pawn because there's a lot of trickery with bringing the rook over and just adding another attacker to try to checkmate them. So that's not going to go down. The other option they have is just taking your knight on d4 straight up with check. If that's the case, you want to block the check with the knight on f2, and that puts their king in check at the same time with a discovery attack. Their king will go to f7, and that's when you want to just bring your queen down to h3. And that is as far as I'm going to go on the lines that they decline the gambit. And next, we got to cover if they accept the gambit with knight capture e5. I must say that this position gives very unfavorable results. You must move your queen to e2 to pin the knight, and black must unpin the knight with queen e7. After this, I've went down every alley there is, and I think that the best move, honestly, is bringing your bishop to f4. There's only one proper reply from black, and that is pushing d6. If they move knight to c6, you can bring your knight to b5, and there's nothing stopping the fork on c7, since the queen is basically foobarred. Even if they exchange off, at least, the analysis is in your favor. And if they try knight to g6, you can take the c7 pawn with your bishop. So assuming they play perfectly and bring the pawn to d6, you bring your knight out to c3. And their best move from here is bringing the knight to c6, and you want to capture. It doesn't matter if they capture with the b pawn. You want to castle. You do not want to take their queen. You want to let them take yours. After they do, you recapture, or it can happen in another order of moves. They can go ahead and take your queen first, you recapture, then they take the knight, and then you long castle. And from this position, there's plenty of different ways it can veer off, but you're still going to be about 1 full point behind on the analysis since you are a pawn behind. So if you choose to play the Alekhine Gambit, hope that they don't accept it and take your pawn on e5, because it's not going to be good. There's nothing you can do. I see a lot of people have tried to play knight to f5, hitting the queen, but that just ends up checking your king, and when you block, it's just no good reply. They're simply just going to push d6 and solidify things, and your only good move is actually withdrawing your knight back to e3. It's just not good. I wouldn't recommend it, but all the other lines are good. But as I said, if they take e5 with that knight in the beginning and accept the gambit, no buenos. All right, gonna wrap this thing up. I do appreciate you guys. I will catch you on the next video. All in all, the Alekhine Gambit can be fun and interesting, just not so much if they accept the gambit by capturing your pawn on e5 with the knight. Thank you. I'll see you on the next.